Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Megan Aronson, and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Science at the University of British Columbia. I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar today. It's entitled Escalating US and China Tensions, Techno-nationalism and Their Implications for Universities in the US and Canada. Why now and what next? Before we begin the webinar, I'd like to point out that UBC Vancouver is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. The land it's situated on has always been a place of learning for the Musqueam, who for millennia have passed on their culture, their history, and traditions from one generation to the next on this site. This webinar respects the history of this place and the traditional Musqueam values. I'd also like to acknowledge the sponsors of today's events, and they are the Center of Chinese Research at the Institute of Asian Research at UBC, the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, and Green College as well at UBC. And as you will have noticed, I should inform you that this webinar and the following question and answer session will be recorded. And by joining this Zoom presentation, we are not asking you to use your camera or microphone to participate in the session, and the question and answer period will be anonymous. The topic of this webinar is, in my view as a scientist, quite timely. From our perspective, it's always been a central tenet in our fields that scientific discovery is inherently international. As scientists, we value the freedom to work on the most important and cutting-edge problems and to build partnerships wherever it best promotes scientific discovery, independent of national boundaries. So it's clear that the incredible investment that China has made in the last 20 years in academic science, and even more so in technology, has made a huge difference in how research is conducted in our countries. We increasingly are seeking ways that will balance our research imperatives in a changing global scene. And we've been looking forward to this webinar in the hopes that it will be formative in terms of how we develop our thinking going forward. So with that introduction, I'd like to go forward with introducing our two panelists, who are John Krieger and Paul Evans. So John Krieger is the Regents Professor Emeritus from the Georgia Tech University. He has just completed a major study of US export controls on technology and knowledge in the Cold War and beyond, with 2 chapters on China. His recent work has focused on the impact of new regulations on US and China collaboration in academia, in the STEM fields, and in biomedicine. Paul Evans is a professor in the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia, working on issues in Canada-China relations. He returns to UBC this fall after a sabbatical leave that was spent mainly in Ottawa, at Harvard University, and at the National University of Singapore, where a major focus has been the downturn in US-China relations and its implications for third countries, with what he describes as an unexpected focus on impacts on universities. Professors Krieger and Evans will each speak for 15 minutes. And so I'd like to start that by asking Professor Krieger to present his commentary.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. In my time, I want to briefly sketch out or give an overview of the situation in the United States, after which Paul will go ahead and talk about what's happening in Canada. In January this year, Charles Lieber, the chair of the Department of Chemistry and Chemical Biology at Harvard University, was led into a federal court in Boston in a yellow jumpsuit with handcuffs around his wrists. Lieber's lab has received more than $15 million in research funds from the Department of Defense and the National Institutes of Health, or NIH. In parallel, though, in summer 2012, he was recruited for 3 years as a high-level foreign expert in the Chinese government's 1,000 Talents program. This program allegedly funded a mirror laboratory for Lieber in the Wuhan University of Technology to the tune of $1.5 million. It also allegedly provided him with a stipend of $50,000 a month and about $160,000 a year for living expenses in China. On June the 9th this year, Lieber was indicted by a federal grand jury on 1 count of lying to the federal authorities about his participation in the 1,000 Talents program, and on 1 count of lying to Harvard about the same. In July this year, he was further indicted for failing to report to the government the income that he'd received from China. Lieber's case caused a sensation, granted his personal and international prestige. He'd been nominated several times for the Nobel Prize for his work in nanoscience and nanomaterials. He's just one of many researchers, many of them of Chinese origin, who have worked in the United States for many years, who have been targeted by the federal authorities for research collaboration with China. As in Lieber's case, contracting to participate in a program devised to contribute to China's scientific development, economic prosperity, and national security, and that's a quote from the 1,000 Talents program, while also receiving federal research dollars, has exposed them to congressional wrath and to judicial inquiry. The 1,000 Talents program was established in 2008, and it is, by a decade later, it recruited about 7,000 people from all over the world. Why has it become a target for the Trump administration today? Of course, this is one aspect of a political decision to confront China across a broad front, and notably in the technological Cold War. But why should academic cooperation in STEM fields, that's science, technology, engineering, and maths, and in biomedicine, be embroiled in these tensions? What effect is this conflict with China having on scientific collaboration between the two countries? And how extensive is it anyway? These are the key issues that I will discuss in this brief presentation. Let's first talk about the scale of international collaboration between these two countries. In academic year 1819, there were 369,000 students from China studying in American colleges and universities. Over the last few years, the number of PhDs awarded to Chinese students in science and engineering in American universities has hovered around 5,000 annually. The latest data that we have suggests that about 85% of these highly trained individuals actually stay on in the United States for at least 5 years after graduating, a serious loss for China. They are part of a vibrant international research community that is engaged in research, in collaborative research with their homeland. In fact, the NSF reported in January this year that about 2 out of 5 papers published by a scholar based in China was co-authored with at least one scholar in another country, and a quarter of those were people from China. In raw numbers, 55,000 papers were co-authored by one person in China and one person in the United States in 2018. In short, Sino-American research collaboration is broad and deep and of mutual benefit to both parties, and we should never forget that. However, it is not only the scale of the research that is important, it is also the kind of research that they do together that matters. Overall, this has shifted since the 1980s from basic research with no obvious or explicit application in view to more applied, socially useful research. This reorientation of university research towards directly satisfying social needs was made possible by a swathe of legislation in the 1980s, beginning above all with the Bayh-Dole Act, that unleashed the entrepreneurial energies of American research academics. Just look at Lieber again. Lieber has published over 400 papers in peer-reviewed journals, but he is also the principal inventor on more than 50 patents and has in fact actively commercialized his research in nanotechnology. In 2001, he created a company called NanoSys Inc. In 2007, he created a nanosensor company called Vista Therapeutics. It's no wonder, therefore, that the Chinese authorities, faced by a dramatic brain drain of some of their brightest and best to the United States, are keen to recruit him with a lucrative offer in the 1,000 Talents program. And it's also no wonder that the United States authorities are worried about the transfer of commercializable knowledge and intellectual property via his military laboratory in Wuhan. Indeed, contracts with the 1,000 Talents program can explicitly require foreign researchers to grant IP rights to China for research that they do there. China's talent recruitment programs, of which there are many, are embedded in an overall planned agenda that seeks to transform the country into a global economic power by the mid-21st century, by 2049 in particular. The Made in China 2025 plan, launched in 2015, has singled out 10 key sectors in which the PRC seeks to secure a dominant share of global markets. They are central to the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution, integrating big data, cloud computing, the Internet of Things, and other emerging technologies into global manufacturing supply chains. Some of their foci, AI, robotics, autonomous vehicles, gene editing, financial technology, will be generic so that many applications or end-use technologies can be built upon them. The Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party has decreed that, I quote, innovation is the destiny of the country, and that through it, China, and I quote, will realize the Chinese dream of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. The Chinese authorities are determined to overcome an historical legacy of foreign oppression from the 19th century onwards, beginning with the Opium Wars, and to dislodge the United States from its dominant position in the world economic order. It's no wonder the United States government is concerned. There is a tendency in the press to assimilate US-China confrontation to a new Cold War. And indeed then, as now, there was a sustained assault by the Reagan administration on the national security risks posed by visiting Soviet researchers in American universities. But the analogy stops there. The Cold War with the Soviet Union was underpinned by a quest for military superiority, above all in the nuclear field. The conflict with China is predominantly about economic superiority, or what is called economic security. That said, the military impact is also on the increase, and universities are once again embroiled. On the same day that Lieber was charged by the FBI, they also posted a warrant for the arrest of Lieutenant Yang Kui-ye of the People's Liberation Army. She was accused of concealing her links with the military when she enrolled as a student at Boston University. There have subsequently been at least 3 more cases of visa fraud of this kind since then. The threat posed by China has been highlighted in widely cited speeches by Christopher Wray, the director of the FBI, over the last couple of years. Wray has accused the Chinese government of using professors, scientists, and students in universities to exploit the openness of American academia, to climb the economic ladder at America's expense. He's also accused university academics of being naive about the risks posed by foreign nationals on American campuses. And he's encouraged what he calls a whole of society response to this threat, encouraging multiple actors to become engaged in tightening their links with China. And I'll get to that in a minute. I want to make one crucial point before proceeding. The American authorities have successfully charged a large number of Chinese businessmen with economic espionage. Press reports and even some law firms often commingle these cases, that's business cases, with charges brought by the Department of Justice against academics like Lieber. They must be carefully separated, however. In practice, it is extremely difficult to charge university researchers with stealing IP because American economic espionage law requires the victim of the theft, in this case the university, to demonstrate that he took reasonable precautions to protect the secrets stolen. This requires formalizing the terms of collaboration to include terms like non-disclosure agreements, procedures that are common in the corporate world, but not at all common in freewheeling, open academic scientific research. Accordingly, the Justice Department focuses most of its attention, as in Lieber's case, on charging researchers with failing to disclose their ties with foreign universities and with concealing financial support from foreign countries. This is also why, rather than seek to criminalize the abuses of academic openness by foreign governments and researchers, the government, some universities, and the federal granting agencies are now proactively intervening upstream in the research process to mitigate the risk of loss of IP to China. And I'll give you some of these actors now and show you what they're doing. So let's begin with the State Department that deals with visas. It has limited recently graduate student visas for people coming from China to 1 year renewable in 3 central fields: aviation, high-tech manufacturing, and robotics. Usually it was 5, and 5 years that you could have your visa for. These fields are all part of the Made in China 2025 program. In addition, now every prospective entrant to the US from China must provide up to 5 years of information on their social media identifiers on 20 different platforms, including many American ones like Facebook. They must provide their telephone numbers and email addresses and their travel histories. And this summer, the State Department expelled more than 1,000 Chinese high-risk graduate students and research scholars who were working at American universities. So the State Department is being very active in trying to curb what it sees as economic espionage. Turning to academia itself, both Harvard and MIT have set up new procedures to watch over grant proposals. At MIT, any project funded by entities in China or that involves collaborating with individuals or entities in China must be evaluated internally by several committees before it even gets out of the door. If it poses a risk, and I quote, to IP, export controls, data security, economic competitiveness, national security, and political, civil, and human rights, the PI must satisfy the administration that he or she has a risk management plan in place. Without such plan, the grant proposal may not go forward. MIT and UC Berkeley, among others, have also decided not to accept any further grant money from Huawei. The NIH has been the most proactive federal granting agency seeking to identify and penalize violations of research integrity among the people and institutions that it funds. In August 2018, its director, Francis Collins, sent out over 10,000 letters to individuals and institutions receiving NIH grants, alerting them that foreign entities had mounted systematic programs to access intellectual property generated in NIH-funded research. He also warned that some peer reviewers of NIH grants had divulged confidential information in grant applications to third persons. The examples given are always in China. Other grantees had failed to disclose substantial financial support received from foreign governments to the NIH of their home institutions or to the government itself. The charge is precisely brought against Lieber. University administrations have collaborated fully in these processes to identify and penalize such unacceptable breaches of trust and confidentiality among its research faculty. To conclude, what can we say about the dangers posed to the United States' economic and national security by collaborating with China? Firstly, I must stress it is not illegal to participate in the Thousand Talents program. It is illegal to lie to the federal government about it. Secondly, it must be stressed that the scale of this problem is relatively small. By my count, since 2017, criminal charges have only been brought against about a dozen researchers in academia and medical research clinics, and a few of these are still pending. Another 10 individuals from 2 cancer research institutions have been forced to resign. In almost every case, as with Lieber, the accused is not charged with spying, although the press is widely presents this case in this manner, but with failing to disclose their links to the Thousand Talents program. As for the NIH, Jody Black, the deputy director of its Office of International Research, reported that by last November, at least 120 scientists, not all of them ethnically Chinese, she pointed out, in 70+ institutions in many fields of biomedicine and all over the US have been involved in one or more violations of research integrity. That, she said, boiled down to theft. Now, even if these numbers have increased substantially since then, I must point out that less than 0.1% of the 300,000 people funded annually by the NHS have violated research integrity as far as the NIH figures give. Let's be clear that the threat from China is real. There is no doubt that some researchers in American universities have, deliberately or not, abused the trust and openness of the research culture to share advanced knowledge and technology with individuals and entities in China, and to dissimulate their employment in talent programs or by the People's Liberation Army. It's obviously important to bring these malpractices under control. It is equally important to keep the danger posed by international scientific collaboration with China in perspective, and not to inflate its nature and its scope. The US research system has benefited enormously from international collaboration. 85%, as I pointed out, of the best and brightest from China stay on in the country for at least 5 years after getting their PhDs. Foreign students overall contribute $37 billion annually to the American economy. They subsidize a public education system that is starved of funds by paying higher fees than national students, and they support 450,000 jobs. And that is FBI data. The openness of science has multiple intellectual, political, and social advantages. It is imperative that measures be taken to protect it from violations of research integrity. It is just as imperative that it not be sacrificed to satisfy the passions of techno-nationalism and of national protectionism. And now I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Megan, for chairing this session. And I'm delighted to have an opportunity to speak on some issues that I've inadvertently run into over the last 2 years. as I visited universities in the United States, in Singapore and in Ottawa. We're into a very turbulent moment in relations with China and in a broader questions of world order where science and universities fit in this turbulent moment. Growing anxieties about developments in China itself, new repression, new regulations, new surveillance, some of the developments inside the United States that John just itemized as they affect universities, some US-China tensions that continue to escalate, fraying multilateral institutions, and new challenges to globalization, the kind of, as universities were part of it, an openness in our exchanges, what we did, a little bit of freewheeling activity. This is an era where the talk is now about decoupling and what we can be doing to break connections in supply chains and in values and idea chains of which universities are a big part. The era that we flourished in those things that John described is in question. And all of this on the verge of a fourth industrial revolution where science, technology, medicine are fusing, where we're on the edge of something that can be extraordinarily exciting. And finally, of course, by COVID. And if it's of interest to people, we can talk specifically about COVID-related research on vaccines and others that are almost an eye of the storm in what is hitting. Well, John used the phrase techno-nationalism, and it's one that I find very useful in understanding what are the forces propelling this particular view of universities, of research, in a context that some describe as Cold War, but that we can certainly describe as deepening US-China confrontation. And to me, techno-nationalism is in some ways not new. States have protected and encouraged particular kinds of players in their societies to go forth. What is interesting about techno-nationalism in the 21st century is that because China and the United States are so much more integrated in a variety of ways, because the United States and China are now competing in areas that are not just directly about military advantage or dual use technologies, but in fact in economic capabilities. Who is going to have some of the kind of dominant high ground in some of the industries of this fourth industrial revolution? We have a conflict that in scope is still somewhat narrow, but expanding dramatically and very quickly. And all under the guise, economic competition is now under the guise of national power and national security. So that the securitization of research is now a reality that communities in both China, the United States, and Canada and elsewhere have to be deeply aware of. When Megan at the beginning talked about science beyond national boundaries, techno-nationalism is about boundaries on steroids and drawing clear distinctions in a very wide set of fields. The American universities are caught in a hurricane of concerns and pressures that are falling on them mainly from above, from an administration, from Congress in a variety of new pieces of legislation, through departments. We heard about Department of State, FBI. It's a kind of whole of government push to restrict, limit, and constrain what are seen as dangerous connections with China, but also, and this is the key, to strangle or constrain the development of certain technologies and their application in China. It is not just defensive, it is offensive in a fairly narrow set of sectors now, but with the possibility of those being expanded. Well, even for countries that don't believe in techno-nationalism, or at least haven't made it a major part of their foreign policies, what is happening in the United States and in Australia, which is on a roughly similar path to the United States. We're all affected by what is happening in the United States. And I see at least 3 dimensions in which what is happening in the US is going to have impact here. And it is, we've got to make clear, this is about a lot more than research collaborations. It is indeed about protection of research, intellectual property, theft in sensitive sectors, cyber intrusions into the kind of infrastructure, research infrastructure in national agencies and in universities. It's also about universities as targets and instruments of foreign influence and interference. Curiously, both in China and the United States, authorities can see universities as a kind of double-edged sword, where they're an area of opening, of exchange, but where they are also a threat to domestic values and institutions. And we're seeing that in the onslaught of regulations that American universities are dealing with now, that the concerns go way beyond research protection and integrity. It's about looking at groups like Confucius Institutes that operate on American campuses that are seen as instruments. It's looking at Chinese student associations as players affecting or corrupting the academic environment and threatening basic academic values like academic freedom. So this is much, much, much bigger than research. And in the dynamics here in Canada, essentially, I think we're in for, are seen if we were characterizing what's been happening in Canada around this. We're not in a hurricane at this moment. We have some actions by our security agencies, our government, working in cooperation with universities to manage one kind of tier of this challenge, and that's mainly been around protection of intellectual property and dealing with cyber intrusions. I'll come back to that in a moment. But we are dealing with knock-on effects from the United States in a variety of ways. One of them is on extraterritoriality, the application of rules in funding agencies in the United States that have impact for Canadians collaborating on projects with not just Chinese partners, but more importantly with American partners who are subject to a whole new set of restrictions on what they can do. Export controls, what kinds of items are going to be seen as worthy of multilateral action. There we are in a context of American pressures for a broadening of the variety of sectors which we should see as sensitive, and not just for dual use as traditionally defined around military, but increasingly around technologies in these fourth industrial revolution areas. And Canadians are negotiating on those matters, but it is clear we are deeply influenced and sometimes pulled by where the Americans are trying to lead that process, so long as they stay in the multilateral business. We've had from the United States warnings and direct threats regarding specific partners. Huawei was mentioned, and it's one that's of concern to a number of Canadian universities. But it's also about specific partners in terms of who they are in China, their connections to the military, their connections to what is called the civil-military fusion, a kind of Chinese military-industrial complex. There have been specific warnings communicated through our governments and in fact sometimes to our institutions. There has been in the United States such an amount of publicity and political involvement in these matters that they are politicized and receiving a great deal of attention in ways that is being picked up and echoed and amplified by at least some inside Canada. And as we have seen at the parliamentary committee, special parliamentary committee on Canada-China relations, universities have started to come into that discussion, and very much from the perspective of the threats that those connections pose to Canadian intellectual property, but also to Canadian values and institutions. And my UBC colleagues are all aware of how this has been raised in at least 2 of the parliamentary hearings in the special committee. So it's rubbing off, it's part of the atmosphere that is now beginning to affect Canada. Well, the reaction has been a pretty interesting one. Our security agencies have been active and carefully active in raising awareness about a new threat environment. There are real challenges from China. And they have raised those with individual universities and associations, working with departments and ministries, federal ministries, like Industry, Science, and Economic Development. The Safeguarding Research Initiative has just created a marvelous portal and a series of kind of briefings that outline what some of the risks are and some of the strategies that can be used to try to identify and minimize those risks. They have organized workshops at more than 30 universities in Canada. It's not just our big research institutions, universities, research-intensive universities. Universities across Canada are involved with research collaborations, student exchanges, professors going back and forth. It's key that in that China has not been formally identified as as culprit or risk number 1. It has been non-national. No countries are named, but it is very clear to participants and to Ottawa that China is the most important country of concern in those lists. Well, an interesting question is why have our agencies, our government, been less involved and less, let me put it this way, more subdued and more careful and more private in the way that they have tried to work with the universities to address these challenges? Well, I think the first reason is that because, unlike the US, there is no consensus in Ottawa that China is an adversary country. Well, in some instances, some issues it is. But the framing of China as a strategic competitor or as an adversary, enemy, or rival is not fully accepted, even though if you read some of our newspapers, you might come to a different conclusion. But there is also in Ottawa a lot of ambivalence about techno-nationalism, what it looks like and whether it's good for Canadian interests. We know that there's going to be a reset very soon. The federal government has indicated that this is going to be happening sometime in the next few weeks, just before or after the American election, where the basic theme, the approach, the narrative from Ottawa is going to become a little bit clearer. But my hunch is that it is not going to come anything close to the consensus position in the United States about the extent and dimensions of a China threat. Another reason I think we've been more subdued is we've had such a positive history in Canada of our interactions, not without some blemishes with China. It's part of the folklore. Engagement has been furthered by these connections in ways that most of the university profs, in fact, almost all of them, admire and want to continue. And I think finally, there is a cautionary tale that is coming out of the United States that John got close to. If you start opening this connection in research, talents programs, and other things, politicizing it, making it public, involving law enforcement agencies, criminalizing, there is a real risk of stigmatization for people who are ethnic Chinese or for those who are not just Chinese nationals, but ethnic Chinese in our country. And I think there are very few Canadian politicians that want to see happen here what has happened in Australia as they've lifted this particular lid in the context of universities. Well, what is coming and what should we be doing? What's next? First, I think we need to prepare for more parliamentary and media attention, focusing on multiple issues related to connections with universities in Canada and China. I think second is that we're on the edge of closer and more elaborate consultation and interaction with our security agencies in threat assessments, including but beyond cybersecurity and IP protection, and looking at particularly interference activities in a very careful, judicious, but important way. I think we had better get ready for a sharpened conversation on due diligence. Who are our partners? How do we measure them? How do we know who they are? What are those connections to the military? How do we assess? We're going to have to be part of a new debate on what are sensitive sectors. Harvard, MIT, and others are pulling their hair out because they do not know what Washington sees as the sensitive sectors. And there's going to be a Canadian involvement in this discussion, at least for our own domestic rules, that I hope we have. I think fourth, focusing on awareness, vigilance, and transparency in our interaction with Chinese partners. We had better be more careful and more public, making both the success stories, some of the risks we face, and the mitigation and other efforts that we're taking in our universities. And I'd conclude by saying that I view these issues from the perspective of trying to keep doors open to China for the reasons that John outlined, but I think that universities play a special role in dealing with issues, not just on the research front, but on exchange of ideas, collaboration, track to exchange activities that are even more important in situations of confrontation than they are when things are going tickety-boo. And having those doors open, I think, is going to mean we're going to have to close some windows, be very clear with Chinese collaborators what we can and can't do in ways that are pretty foggy right now, pretty uncertain, fuzzy. But at the same time, remember that on balance, cooperation with China can benefit both of us and help us address some of those big global and international issues that the world in this turbulent moment is facing. Thank you.
So I'd like to thank both of the speakers, and with that, we're entering into the question and answer period. So I'd remind you that since this is a webinar, I'd like you to submit your questions via the question and answer function that you'll find at the very bottom of your screen. I see that we have a few questions already there, so please feel free to start putting your questions in at this time. I'm going to be monitoring that window, and your questions will be posed anonymously to the panelists, so you will not be speaking. So please go ahead and put your questions and comments in at your convenience. So to begin the question and answer session, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Professor Alison McFarlane, who is the Director of the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at UBC. She was formerly Director of the Institute for International Science and Technology Policy and a professor at George Washington University. In addition, she served for 3 years from 2014 through 2016 as the head of the United States Nuclear Energy Commission. Alison.
Great, thanks, Megan. Thanks, Paul and John and everybody for the invitation to start things off. That was fascinating to both of you. Lots of thoughts on this, and I'll just share a couple with you and raise some questions as well. I think now there are certainly, from my experience on the nuclear industry end of things, there are legitimate concerns about counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items, some of which may come from China. And they have big impacts for nuclear safety and security risks. You can imagine digital parts of nuclear power plants that, if not done properly, could be either safety risks or security risks. And this was an issue that we grappled with when I was at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the US. And we have been moving into a dependence on the digital. We wouldn't be having this meeting this way if it weren't for our dependence on the digital. And it's a good thing, but it's also a bad thing, and it introduces vulnerabilities that can be exacerbated or used for nefarious means. And so this is something that I think we're all a little more attuned to these days. In the US, and speaking as an American, you know, in the past, the attitude was characterized by Joseph Nye's soft power, where, you know, you invite your enemies in, or some people you think might become enemies, and you bring them into the university and you train them and you show them the value of the American way and American culture and the American education. And that was a way to project power. But, you know, in the past 5-10 years, we've seen, especially in the US, you see a turn to isolationism, a reaction against globalism, and the neoliberal turn, which has been happening for a long time, but is really manifesting now. I think it's interesting to reflect a little bit about the redefinition of what's kept secret. Universities haven't really been places for classified research, though I don't know, John, maybe you want to argue with me on that one. But the idea of the university is for it to be open and everything to be available. Classified research is for national laboratories and places like that in the tech realm. But now it seems there's a redefinition of what is deemed secret or proprietary. And this idea of proprietary is in more on the industry side of things, but it's been sliding into academia because you have, you know, all these biotech and nanotech and other folks who are both academics, but also private industry people. And so you have this slippage of proprietary information into academia, which maybe we didn't have so much before. I don't know, I look to the historians here to help me. And so I guess what this brings up for me is what are some of the implications for democracy of this slide? So I'll leave it there and look forward to the question and answer period. Thanks a lot.
So thank you. I don't think you need to look forward very much longer because we are definitely starting the question and answer period at this time. So we have several questions already in the box. And so I'll start with the first one. When does information sharing of research stop and IP theft begin? Are there objective criteria that universities could apply in order to maintain research integrity?
Let me start the answer, and I think John can dig a little bit deeper into it. I think that the assumption has been until fairly recently that universities are in the business of creating information that is going to be published, that is going to come out. Well, there have been private reports and other things. On balance, we saw that universities were in the business of creating peer-reviewed articles or at least publicly available information. That's becoming quite complicated now because it is one of the main American concerns is information that has, before publication or publication through fraudulent means, is destroying the integrity of our whole peer review system. And one of the things that was most powerful why universities have got on board with some of the concerns about Chinese activities is they're worried about the integrity of the research process. So just having something published or out there in the published world is no longer, it's no longer a guarantee that you aren't going to be a target for what are seen as improper activities. And that, boy, that makes things more complicated.
So I'd like to offer a follow-up, which comes from one of the other questions, which is specifically, what are some of the mechanisms through which China gains commercial advantage from non-classified scientific research?
Could I just make a comment about that? It's a mistake to think about academic research as either simply classified or open. There's a vast category in between called SBU, sensitive but unclassified information. And this has become increasingly important over the last 20 years. And one of the ways of managing that is through export controls. And export controls, every university in the many universities now have export control officers on campus to monitor the kind of information and knowledge that they share with others. For that purpose, at least, there are lists called, in fact, the Commerce Control List, which lists thousands of dual-use technologies which are subject to controls to certain countries of concern, above all China. So the real transformation has been also in the wide scope of dual-use technologies, which have both obviously commercial and military applications. And all of these that we're speaking of in this new industrial revolution, fourth industrial revolution, are all clearly dual-use. The answer as to how China takes advantage of that, I don't know how to answer that, because I don't know how the Chinese actually exploit that in particular cases. But we have cases. The famous one is of a young man at Duke University who trained in a thing called metamaterials at Duke University and went home to China, constructed a mirror lab, and then launched a huge business. He was subsequently called the Elon Musk of China. And the interesting thing about his case was that the FBI investigated him and found that and the university investigated him, there was no theft of IP in that case. So asking for objective criteria is extremely difficult. What you have to do is to set up mechanisms to try to decide and to qualify those kinds of things, which in your particular case, you think might be sensitive, commercializable, or utilizable in the field.
So thanks. I'd like to move on to the next question. On the subject of COVID-19 vaccine nationalism, should governments share their vaccine IP and trade secrets openly in order to get the global economy running as soon as possible? I don't mean that they would give their own vaccine stocks to foreign countries. That seems politically unrealistic. But why not be open about how to make vaccines so foreign states can attempt to build their own vaccine production as fast as possible?
Paul. You want to start, Paul?
But I don't have an answer to this kind of question. But I can put it in a context. The heightened concerns about theft or borrowing, improper borrowing of research that was done either collaboratively with Chinese partners or that has been done independently in different countries. I think we are hearing reliable information that the number of efforts to try to get a hold of fast-breaking research by commercial firms or by state-run firms is increasing, that the pattern of intrusions is expanding, so that we see this on the negative side as an example of a field where by hook or by crook, there are enormous efforts to try to find out what competitors are doing. And that is something that I'm certain our research institutes, our professors working in this field are aware of. On the broader issue of how can cooperation go forward, this is a great question for the World Health Organization, not just about sharing vaccines, but about the kind of, however difficult it's going to be, protocols for exchange on these matters when we get closer to having some vaccines that might go out there. And this goes so much beyond just the scientific research. It's healthcare people where they're going to look at implementation. Global cooperation would be wonderful, but boy, is it going to be complicated.
Could I just make a comment too? And in April, there were about 200 groups of scientists working extremely actively together globally, sharing all their information on vaccine research. I mean, way before we got close to any kind of actual vaccine itself. And there are a large number of social actors in this. Of course, there are pharmaceutical companies, there's the Bill Gates Foundation, there are national governments. And the hope is that at least some of these countries and governments will have programs in which they don't simply try to grab all the vaccine for themselves. The Bill Gates Foundation has that as an aim, to get a cheap vaccine available for anyone in the world who wants it. And I guess that China politically might also have that aim. On the other hand, I should also stress that there's not just going to be one vaccine. There's going to be many, many, many vaccines. And the hope is that through that mechanism, at least eventually and very quickly, all populations in the world might be covered, because the competition for just one vaccine would be ruthless, but the competition for many will, I hope, be much more muted. The people who get it first will obviously be the most industrialized countries, but we could hope that it will diffuse rapidly through the world. At least that's my hope, because there are so many possible ways. There hope to be so many possible vaccines for COVID.
So I'd like to move on to a different question. This is, what are your respective views of the Chinese perception of the crisis that they are causing in cooperation? Do they see a downside to their conduct? And I wanted to add just a additional phrase on this myself, which is, can you possibly address this from the perspective of the researchers at universities in China as well?
Let me take a first cut at it, because it's inside the question is built a premise about how we can communicate with Chinese partners on this in a informed and constructive manner, but also while protecting ourselves and themselves. It's there are in the United States a variety of universities and of associations of universities that are engaged in discussions with Chinese organizations on issues like the talents program and what would be necessary from the Chinese perspective, what they would need to adjust to reduce the dangers and the negative perceptions about those talent programs. So I think we're going to, at that level, it's going to have to be an American-led discussion, because it's the Americans who are most concerned. From a Canadian angle, as we look at our partners in China, we're going to have to begin a discussion, a very awkward discussion, on the use of research. And this is from the science side, but also from social sciences and humanities. One of the considerations we have now is that many of our colleagues are deeply concerned about the application of their research findings in particular context of human rights violations. And boy, this is a sensitive topic on the Chinese side. But I think there are ways that they now recognize the anxiety on our side, and that instead of a kind of a traditional human rights dialogue, we can talk about the end purposes of research. We're going to need some track 2 activities. We're going to need our university administrators to be honest about some of the problems up front and to try to find a way. I think many Chinese recognize that the talents program has problems internal to it. I think they find that they need more guidance on what kind of information they should disclose before they visit a university. They don't want disappointments. They don't want to have visas not approved or delayed indefinitely. So even before we do this at a very formal level, there's an obligation for those of us at institutions like UBC to begin an honest but quiet discussion on some of these matters.
I toured China last summer teaching in about 3 different universities. So I probably lectured to about 100 graduate students in the humanities and social sciences. And all of them desperately want to maintain their links with China, with the United States. All of them actually are encouraged to all of them speak English, all of them publish in English, all of them are evaluated by publishing in peer-reviewed journals in English. And for them, any kind of threat or menace to this international collaboration with the United States is a dramatic disappointment and a disaster. All of them hope, I believe, that this situation will right itself and that they can keep the links going. In, at least these are people that I've spoken to in the humanities and social sciences.
Well, thank you. A related question is, as a middle power with close economic and security ties to the US, Canada has increasingly found itself caught in the middle of this growing confrontation between the US and China, as evident in the Huawei extradition case, for instance. How should Canada navigate this confrontation and manage its relationship with these two major powers?
Let me take a cut at this one too. It was interesting that the question focused initially on the Madam Meng and Tu Michaels affair. I think one of the most important policy questions in Ottawa now, as it is going to be releasing its new China framework, is going to be our Huawei 5G decision. And I think we will be able to read into that a great deal about the political calculations, the information that is influencing decisions in Ottawa. And my personal hope is that that decision, even if it restricts considerably Huawei's involvement in our 5G rollout, won't close the door to interactions with Chinese companies, including Huawei, in other sectors. In other words, that nuance in the decision and a signaling that we do not support the general principle of decoupling from China in high technology areas. I mean, there are some in Australia, many in the United States, that see the Huawei ban as the first in a series of limitations on other kinds of interactions with China. The alternative way is to identify the precise threat, risks, and vulnerabilities and deal with that rather than signing on to an American Cold War confrontation and techno-nationalism. But the pressures in Ottawa are complex. Security agencies have special interests and now new kinds of connections and involvement in our public debate that is going to make that decision something we watch with great care, because I think it tells us where we're going to be positioning, not just on Huawei and 5G, but a whole set of other issues related to technological integration with China.
So we have several questions that are on the general area of students. And so the first one would be, are foreign students studying in China usually heavily monitored? Or does it depend on the nationality of the student in terms of being watched? For example, are US students more closely surveyed than Canadian students?
I have no way of answering that question.
I think it's a great question because we need to know the answers to it in a more sophisticated and systematic way than we know. The experience of most of our students in China, Canadian students going to China, is that they identify increased surveillance that is occurring in Chinese classrooms. Our students at the Yanqing Academy, our students at the Schwarzman program, which are elite kind of programs, are very aware that what goes on in a Chinese classroom, in English in particular, or in Chinese, is very carefully watched. Whether there's special attention to American students as compared to Canadian, I suspect not. But I think that the conversations there are monitored clearly. And the professors and the Chinese students that are in those classes, mixed, are subject to some forms of discipline or at least careful observation. We now face this issue in spades because of us doing our teaching on Zoom, where we have a number of our students at UBC who are resident in China. And the big question is how far what is going on in our classes that are on Zoom or equivalent are going to be monitored. For what purposes? We try to protect the identity and the academic atmosphere in our rooms, but we don't know the answer. It's a particular vulnerability. And having this kind of conversation with our Chinese friends, many of whom don't like this increasing surveillance, but who see it as a reality of the moment, is exactly where we are.
Thank you. The next question is, could you comment on the cultural aspect of student exchanges and research collaborations regarding the potential benefit of understanding values and mindset of the other side versus the perceived risk of corrupting American, Canadian, and Western values?
Well, that's a great question. And of course, it's an extremely difficult question to answer.
Yes.
I think there's no doubt that the Chinese students whom I've taught here in the United States obviously have their minds opened in all sorts of ways and are affected by it. Does it have any longer term effects? I don't know. In the opposite direction, I don't believe that Chinese students visiting the United States change attitudes deeply. There's a study being done by a colleague of mine in Washington who points out that the Chinese students who come to the United States tend to be ghettoized and live in very tightly knit communities with very little interaction with the American students on their campus. That's not, I haven't got a lot of hard data about that, but that was her first impression. And of course, if that's the case, there's going to be very little information or exchange of values actually taking place.
Yeah, it's very complex, person by person, program by program, what you pick up when you study in another country. But I would say something that is a rising stress level, both to the few students that we have, Canadian students in China right now. Most aren't there, the COVID thing. But Chinese students in the United States. I had a chance to work with some of the Harvard profs who were thinking through this issue. And the general feeling among the students that are at Harvard is they feel under enormous stress now. They feel under stress partly because they are worried about when they go home, how they are going to be treated because of infection of Western values and approaches. They are a scene of suspicion. But they also feel that in the United States now, along the lines that John mentioned with FBI director's Ray comment, that all of them are spies, are part of unconventional security, unconventional information gatherers. And so the level of stress on Chinese students in the United States have gone up dramatically. So one thing we may be producing is people who are just much more suspicious about political atmospheres in the US and China. How they feel about Canada, great question. We better do more research on this topic at home in the context of advice we'll be giving to our governments and to our university administrators.
So the next question asks whether university scientific communities in Canada have a threshold for not tolerating human rights violations that are carried out by Chinese authorities within China against minority groups like the Uyghurs. What would it look like if, what would remaining connected as a scholar and scientific global community member mean for an apartheid-like strike or action?
Let me give some thoughts on this. And the question is one that is very much alive in our institutes and at UBC. And I frame it around not just people's concerns, our academics' concerns, our students' concerns about what is an abhorrent situation in Xinjiang, where it runs against our values, it runs against our sense of history of how you handle nationalities issue, as we are still dealing with our own history of some of these matters in Canada. So it's a painful issue. But The question is on due diligence, and I'll give an example. If we invite a speaker or a guest professor or a visiting professor to the University of British Columbia, and that professor had expressed ideas in China that seemed to support the approach of the Chinese government in Xinjiang, should that speaker be invited? Should we be giving a stage to someone, even if that isn't their topic, to come to UBC? How do we vet visitors? And whether it's Harvard or UBC, this is a new kind of question. We've always looked for people who present ideas in an interesting way, good researchers, good thinkers. But now should there be a special burden as it relates to the views of the individual on topics where we don't like what the Chinese government is doing? And that's a debate that is fulsome. I think it's our social scientists. I haven't heard our scientists involved in this conversation. But it's the kind of conversation we're going to have more of in months to come.
All right, for the next question. Last week, the US designated the Chinese CCP government as a transnational organized crime group. The question is, how do you think the Canadian government and academic institutions should react to this?
Megan, I'm not sure if the question is that China is a transnational organized crime group. Was that the premise?
That is the assertion of this question.
Well, I wouldn't agree with that characterization of what China is. There's a dimension of that in our interactions with China, but as a nation state, it's doing many other things that are not just about transnational crime. The challenges there are enormous in working with them in any case, but in framing China in that way, kind of misses the complexity of the things we don't like about China and how we then find ways to live with China despite that. If we want progress on vaccines and pandemics, if we want progress on issues like climate change or poverty or international institutions, China is not always a rogue actor. In fact, in general terms, it is at least as likely to support the rules and norms of international regimes as any other great power. It pushes some of them in other directions. But I think just as we have to deal with China in these matters, we're also going to have to deal with the United States that is doing a whole number of things that are a deep concern to us about the rules-based order we want. So I'd frame China a little bit differently and try
I'd like to make a clarification that's come in, which is the question is not about the state, but the Communist Party.
Interesting question, because there's been a real effort by many to try to distinguish the Chinese state from the Chinese people, from the Chinese Communist Party. And that's a complex set of distinctions to make. The Chinese Communist Party has, 95 million members. Most of the people we work with in our academic exchanges, at least a goodly number of them, are members of that Chinese Communist Party. Does it function as a group, as a transnational criminal organization? Again, I don't think that quite gets it accurately about the challenge of the Chinese Communist Party. For better or for worse, again, we have to deal with it. And the idea that we can separate the Chinese people from the Chinese Communist Party and government in an era where most of the research indicates that the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government has higher trust ratings from its population than the American government does, or political parties in the United States, or for that matter in Canada. So these need some fine distinctions.
I would just like to make a short comment about that. We deal with a lot of governments that we don't like and a lot of parties and political institutions that we don't like. And we have to decide whether it's worth doing it or not. And I think it's important to realize that Paul stresses this as complex. It is also a statement made in a specific political context. And not everybody in that context, if it's for example, comes from the United States, would even agree with the statement. So I think it's very important not to get ensnared into trying to react to each of these very hostile, negative characterizations of the party or of the country. We have to simply decide that that's one possibility. We should be aware of it, but there are multiple other ways of thinking about the problem, as Paul stresses. And to understand it is part of a political campaign. And as such, we must be careful who is behind that political campaign and what is their agenda, and what about people around them who totally disagree with them and with whom we might want to have a different kind of conversation.
So I'm mindful of the time. We're coming to the end of the question and answer period. And so I'd like to conclude with the following extremely timely question. I'm not sure if you'd both like to speculate, but clearly this person would like you to speculate. How do you think that US-China relations could change if Biden is elected the next president of the United States, and the impact it could have on the research and educational space? Or is there a direction that you hope US-China relations could go? Thank you for providing your insights on this complex topic.
So shall I start, Paul? Well, I think the important thing to realize is that a large number of members of the Democratic Party who support Biden are also extremely hostile towards China. In other words, there cannot be, and China, of course, Biden himself is being branded as China Joe by his opponent. So he's going to have a very clear position on China and take a rather strong position on China. So the first thing I would want to say is I don't expect massive changes. On the other hand, I do hope for a softening of the position. I mean, both Paul and I obviously are in favor of opening doors, closing some windows, but opening doors, and a more multilateral approach towards the situation in China. But to expect, I think, any dramatic shift is expecting too much. I don't think it will be settled with the American people at this particular point. If there's going to be a shift, it's going to involve a huge amount of education and discussion and representation of what is actually happening in China and why it's important for the United States to collaborate with it. And that will also involve changes on the China side, because unless the Chinese administration changes its approach towards the West and the United States in particular, it's going to be even more difficult for Biden to shift sharply with regard to his predecessor.
I agree with the way John has predicted what might happen, but I'd add a couple of things about what we should be looking for if there is a Biden administration, and what some of my US administrative colleagues at their institutions are hoping for. One is that there will be more subtlety and precision in exactly what are those sensitive areas and difficult areas where techno-nationalism should apply. I think that even while there's a lot of distrust of Huawei and some of the telecommunications companies, that a Biden administration would be more surgical as compared to using a hammer, sledgehammer, in guiding the specific kinds of constraints it puts in place. Second is that I think we should be looking very carefully at what it would do on the issue of visa issuance and responding to the universities that are terribly concerned about some of the application of Washington's big pressure. There are considerable voices who are tough on China, but who think that this has gone too far, that there can be some steps back to what I might call informed cooperation with the universities. This has been a top-down driven process, even with considerable consensus in Congress and in the political side. Universities have not designed these processes. They're sensitive to what some of the risks are, but I think the Biden government would have much deeper consultation with university communities, with the associations, with physicists and science associations, and try to depoliticize this a bit, to treat it as a concrete policy problem rather than an ideological crusade. At least that's something we can look for.
So I want to thank the panelists, of course, and also to the participants. I'm very sorry that we weren't able to get to all the questions. We only answered, well, less than half of the questions that were offered, and I do apologize for that. But I think the debate was exceptional. And so with that, I'd hope that you found the webinar informative and thought-provoking, and that it provides you some guidance or perhaps context as we work our way through this complex and rapidly evolving issue. So I want to inform you that the recording of this webinar would be found on the website of the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. That's www.sppga.ubc.ca. And with that, I'd like to conclude this webinar.